And it's the culmination of teaching environmental politics for many years, and it represents in many ways my thinking on the topic. And it was often called by my students the bad news course, especially climate crisis, because it was hard to say something positive. And so I was always looking for something constructive to say, some alternative, particularly as it pertains to democracy, because there's a large discussion in the literature that says that more democracy is the solution, and other people say democracy is the problem. So I tried to find a way in between these two arguments, and that's what I call participatory governance in sustainable communities, which is the subtitle of the book. This is an evolution from the larger argumentative turn, but I was at a meeting. Well, first I would say that governance sort of swept in and in the discipline, and everything suddenly became governance instead of government. And this was the new orientation, so it was difficult to avoid this, but I was at a meeting in the Netherlands a long time ago, and I was on a panel, and I talked about interaction between citizens and experts. And the discussant, which was an older gentleman, an influential man, maybe the head of the program, I forget, he said, "Oh, no, no, you don't understand. You can't talk about this. Citizens can't understand experts." Something like this. And I saw a young man in the back of the room sort of raising his eyes like, oh, what is this man talking about? And so he came up to me and he said, "I'm embarrassed that the man from my country, India, doesn't know anything about the projects that we have." And he told me about a big participatory governance project that they had in Kerala, India, which sounded very impressive. So I visited him. And this is where my research on participatory governance started. I became very interested. I went also to another project later in Nepal, and then to another one in Thailand, which were the main ones that I researched. But this is the origin of this interest. Plus then kind of theoretical, I developed some theoretical thoughts based on that field of research. Well, this was an ongoing project that the citizens were involved in. They were doing this, and basically when I was there, the people who ran the project, which was actually the government, they showed me how they do this. They introduced me to citizens who explained what they were doing, and as well as experts who were participating. Started with the argumentative turn, and this this led to the focus on citizens and experts. And in the 1990s, I was actually in the late 80s, I was invited to come to Europe to talk about this. And there, in one part of my trip, I landed in Berlin, Germany, where I ended up spending a lot of time, and I'm still there. And there, environmental politics was the big topic, particularly because of the Green Party. And I hadn't really experienced anything like this, but the role of expertise, because the environmental problem has a technical ecological dimension was very big, and so it became a topic, a more substantive topic in which I could pursue this argumentative perspective, particularly with relation to citizens and experts. So that's how I evolved into that. Actually, in Germany at this time, policy analysis wasn't a very common topic. And so to stay there at a research center, I had to find something to do. But quite available and very fascinating was environmental policy. So that's how that came about. And then I started teaching it, and I stayed with this topic for a long time. The environmental movement started with experts, social movements and experts on the ground, but because in the beginning you could smell with your nose the dirty river or the polluted air, right? But then as we got further into it, it became more technical and required instruments to discover the particles and things in the air, to be more specific, toxic chemicals and so forth. And so environmental politics became increasingly professionalized. And so this created a tension between the citizen movements and the experts in government agencies and other important places where decisions were being made. I was actually interested in a small part of this question because in environmental political theory, it always said we need more environmental democracy, we need environmental deliberative democracy, and so I was asking what we know about that. Is that true? And if so, what would it look like? And the reason I was in the developing countries, quite astonishingly, is that it was there that I found these projects, not in the developed world. You would expect from the big democratic countries, the countries that are seen to be big democracies, you would find these experiments, but they were actually I found them in the others. So that's what took me there. It's not that I'm arguing that participatory democracy is the solution, but I'm saying it's part of the solution. And it's, if we want to save democratic politics during the hard times of environmental crisis, say 30 to 50 years, then we need to think quite differently, because it's quite likely that there will be increasing authoritarian trends as the military has to come in to stop civil violence when people are migrants are flooding to another country to try to get in. The water level is rising and so forth. Could be a lot of chaos. So people will accept a strong government at the top. So my question is, what happens to democratic values? And I try to find an arena for them, and that's in this participatory governance. We don't know, but I'm saying that we should be thinking in terms of real, concrete situations. Environmental political theory is rather abstract and removed from the world. Good for going to conferences, but not so good for helping citizens in need in the future. So I'm trying to think of strategies, alternative strategies that might be useful. But this all extends out of the argumentative turn perspective, too. It emerged from some concrete experiences. I actually started out as a very empirical researcher and had some trouble explaining to people that the meaning of the empirical findings weren't obvious, and that they had to be put into different frameworks. This sounds rather naive today because it's sort of obvious, but it wasn't really so obvious then. And so this started a long journey to find a way to clarify that. And along the way, also, the field of policy analysis was emerging. This was really in the early stages, and in the United States, it played a big role in two major programs. One was called the War on Poverty, and experts were called to Washington to develop a large-scale program. And then there was the Vietnam War, which was also guided by experts, statistics, systems analysis, operations, research, and that sort of thing. And there was a tremendous enthusiasm. In fact, one magazine carried an article called The Policy Analysis Explosion, right? It was everywhere. Universities were developing programs, students were getting involved. It was seen as a way to be academic but also relevant. Down the road, it became clear from some studies, particularly dissertations, that this policy analysis, which was commissioned, wasn't always used that much. In fact, the outcome wasn't that impressive. A man named Peter de Leon, who was an important man in the field, he once argued in an article that cost-benefit analysis wouldn't pass a cost-benefit analysis test. He was being ironic, but it wasn't that it wasn't used, but the question came up, not should we get rid of it, because it's not so widely used. It costs a lot of money, but not so widely used. But are we providing the wrong kind of advice? In other words, for policy analysis emerges historically to inform decision making. So it's not like general social science. If you're in general social science, you could avoid this question. You say, I'm just doing theoretical research for itself, right? I don't have to help somebody. If it does, fine. If no, well, that's not my task. But if you go into applied policy analysis, you've sort of committed yourself, at least in terms of the principles, to producing knowledge that would be usable in the political process, in the policy process. So then the question was, and it arose around the caption, what is usable knowledge? This was an article, a small book by a famous man named Charles Lindblom, and it was called Usable Knowledge. And we entered into this, and we suggested, people like John Forrester and myself, that a better way to approach it would be to examine what's going on the ground, so to say, and one sees rather quickly that decision makers are advancing arguments. They're arguing with each other about what should we do, right? In other words, they're trying to develop an action program, and so they debate with each other, right? So the question then arose, the possibility, could we shift the argument from sort of standard social science research to the question of how could we improve these arguments? So they need help formulating their positions, and they advance these through the process of argumentation with each other. In politics, people argue, and some arguments are good, and some arguments aren't so good. So the question arose, is there a way to analyze arguments to find out maybe is there a logic to argumentation? And if so, are there certain things you have to say? Are there certain things that could be tested? And how could we enter this process to improve it? Here there could be some questionable data, so we could inform that. And arguments are a kind of mix of empirical things and normative things sort of fused together, but this fusion sort of blurs the lines, and so people often talk past each other. So the idea was, could we look at this process, understand it better, how people communicate, and find an alternative way to social science, which was producing, policy science was producing research that followed the standard social science model. Generalizable knowledge, right? We found this, we tested it, it works here, it works there, but the decision maker says, I'm not there and I'm not here, I'm in here and I need to know something about my problem, could you help me? So this is different than what the general social science methodology would generate. So we were looking for a different way. It's still a part, but we recognize it to be only a part of the larger process, and we wanted to know how it interacts with the other components. This is an important point because many people challenged us in the beginning, misunderstanding us and saying, oh, well, you're throwing social science out. But we weren't. In fact, what we were doing is making it more complicated because you had to add this communicative, the analysis of the communicative setting, the interaction, and so forth, to see the effect of the data, not to eliminate the data, but to see how it fits into the discussion, influences the discussion, and so forth. So what this is about, in a way, is to examine what the findings, what their implications are for the policymaking process. Back then, it was sort of ignored. It was just assumed that you have these findings and they have implications. But then you would decide that people interpreted these in very different ways. And so what some people found to be workable and good, other people said, no, we don't want this at all, right? We don't care if you have valid knowledge, right? And so we're looking at this interplay with the knowledge in the normative context. And this also is what led to the interaction between experts on the one side and citizens and politicians on the other side, because they're bringing these other elements in effect. This is it basically involves a deliberative process, an interaction to get the different opinions. People sometimes say, oh, well, you see the argumentative turn, that's nice, but you can't operationalize it. But that misses the point. It's about how to think about different things, not to plug in sort of things. So to develop this deliberative interaction that hopefully could lead to common understandings, and if you're lucky, a consensus about what to do. The problem for policy analysis that ignores this is it runs afield, it runs into trouble because those problems are there and they don't go away. You can say, well, I did the research, I gave it to them, that's not my problem. But it remains, and it will determine what happens to this research, whether it's understood, whether it's simply rejected out of because of political interest or whatever. We say from the argumentative turn, we're not actually inventing a new methodology per se, or we're not saying, here's a new thing, try that. What we're doing is trying to uncover and explicate what actually is already going on in the process. And people who commission expertise, they also at some level deliberate with the experts about, like, well, what do you have, what does it mean, and so forth. But these are exclusionary discussions. I mean, managers deliberate among themselves, but they don't open the door and ask more people to come in and present their opinions. So to the degree that you are implementing this out there where those people are, who have understandings of the situation, they have different motivations, there are questions of legitimacy, it's very useful to bring them in and to clarify, to work through these kinds of issues, rather than just say, here's the project, we put it out there, I have no idea what will happen, we'll see what happens, and very often, in many projects, well, that's the end of it. So you need to kind of work with the people who have to carry it out, so that they understand it, they see what's going on, they believe in it, and offer suggestions about, oh, well, see, we're here, we're different over here than those people are over there, but if you said this way, we could adjust it a little bit, so maybe it would work over here. That sort of thing. I was in Thailand a couple of years ago. We had a panel here on this topic. A municipality called Ken Kon, where the University of Mara Sarakam is in Thailand, and they decided to do their decision-making differently, thanks to a progressive mayor who set up a deliberative system and an office called participation promotion, and this office set up sub-municipalities within the municipality and divided the city into small parts, and each part started engaging in deliberations about what their problems were and what they thought transportation should be like and how it should be better organized. And then a group of scholars, mainly urban planners and policy analysts at the university, the local university, Mara Sarakam, they developed what they referred to as a think tank, and this think tank became advisory to the citizen deliberation processes. In other words, they didn't make the decisions, but they helped the citizens find the information that they needed. They did surveys first of the area to find out what the conditions were, to help to serve as a background for the deliberation and so forth. And so they had local deliberations, and then they had representatives who went to a next higher level deliberation to talk with the other sub-municipalities to try to form a common decision. And then this went to the government agencies, which interacted with them, and then the mayor, and the mayor used these findings to develop his policies. So you had this interaction between the citizens and the experts to develop a public policy. I think it's very important. Without this, it doesn't work, because citizens do need information. They're not in the role to provide this information, but the experts serve the role of facilitator of the deliberation. In fact, the mayor defined himself not as the man in charge. It was a very interesting mayor, but as his role as facilitator of the community. Now, the community would decide for themselves, and they changed a lot of policies. The main argument tend to be that, oh, well, this takes too much time. Right? Oh, this is nice, but policy analysts don't have time for this. But the counter argument is it's worth taking the time because it helps to avoid the findings being ignored or useless. I mean, to facilitate them. And if the idea is to help the decision maker, well, the decision maker's process is not just the data, it's also how to relate this to the community. So why not see that as part of the job? Actually, Harold Laswell saw this too, but this part of his work, his famous work, was tended to be neglected. So we see Harold Laswell spoke of his project, the policy sciences, as the policy sciences of democracy. So what we say is we are trying to make good on his project. We're extending the part about democracy, the policy science of democracy. This was left out, and policy science went rather technical, if not technocratic. Well, I would say I have written that this is not easy. This makes the task more complicated, although it recognizes what's involved in the process, that the process involves this communicative interaction, and that the field of policy analysis might want to consider developing a subfield in the field, yeah, a specialization concerned with the communicative dimension of public policy. Instead of just, we did the research, thank you very much, finished, goodbye, that we also have people who examine how this interaction takes place, and to help, like the experts in Ken Kon in Thailand, how to facilitate this interaction with the community, the decision makers and the community. This is a different sort of thing. I did have one interesting and very surprising experience about this. I was invited a few years back to give a keynote speech at the annual meeting of what do they call it? Anyway, communication studies or communication science, the International Association. And what I was totally surprised to discover was that they knew more about the argumentative turn than typical policy analysis scholar did. Most have heard of it by this point. But these people, because they're engaged in the study of communication, they found this part very interesting, how we communicate these things, how people argue in the communication process, and how they could discover, well, you actually don't mean what you say, or that this part of the argument isn't true, so we could correct this, and then we have a blockage, and could we open the blockage so we could go forward in the discussion, and so forth. So they were actually already specializing in this, but it's a different field, and we don't know anything about them, or not much, right? But we could have especially a specialization in the field of policy that focuses on just this part, which is also an empirical topic. But the argumentative turn tries to open this in this way, mainly on a theoretical thing. Then we did the argumentative turn revisited, because in this 20 years, there was a very large number of things that happened that didn't exist when we started. Nobody was talking about discourse analysis. Nobody was talking about narratives. Nobody was talking about deliberation, participatory governance. All of these things weren't topics, and in this 20 years, all of this emerged. So we tried to bring them up, we tried to update the thing. And one important dimension is in Europe, 11 or 12 years ago, there was a meeting and around these topics, and it gave rise to an association which meets every year called Interpretive Policy Analysis Conference, the International Interpretive Policy Conference, and it meets right after this meeting, unfortunately, because that makes it a little bit stressful. I have to fly back to Germany and then go immediately to England for this conference. But the whole conference, it has 300 or 400 people, and they just focus on these topics. Argumentation, discourse, deliberation, interpretation, and things like this. And in Europe, for young doctoral students and postdoctoral students, this became very, very popular. And then we started a journal as a result of this called Critical Policy Studies. And that emerged out of this, out of the need, actually, to find a venue where people could publish this sort of thing. When Forrester and I started, we had trouble going to conferences because if people say, oh, well, what is that? What is it? This is public policy panel. That must be political theory. You're doing something else, right? And it took a while before enough people say, no, no, this is interesting. This is about public policy. So then they say, okay, well, we have to have one guy from this other perspective, right? And this is so how it sort of got bigger and bigger. But it started out with like, oh, we don't know what you're talking about. This isn't really what we do. So until in the review, I believe, of the argumentative turn revisited, Professor Guy Peters wrote a book review, and he said that we had managed to become one of the competing perspectives. So we had arrived in our view. The most important thing, particularly for young scholars, for people doing a PhD, is to pick a topic that you really find interesting, that really motivates you. A lot of people don't do this. They pick a topic because they think they'll get the PhD fast. But what happens is, after you have the PhD and then you get a job and so forth, you don't have a lot of time for new and original research. So you have to keep trying to get something out of that research to publish, right? Well, if it's done quickly, there's not too much there, and also it sort of dies out. You need something that you feel really committed to, that you feel important, something that you could relate to, and this, I think, is the basis for a real career. Otherwise, it's sort of one-off. Okay, I did a dissertation, what next? In other words, from a really good topic, the next topic already shows itself. It comes out of that topic. And beyond that, I would say, work hard.